Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're cracking the code on a massive structural shift in how global geopolitics actually operates. If you've been watching the news over the last several years and felt like international relations have just gone completely off the rails, well, you're definitely not alone. We're going to map out exactly what's happening behind the scenes of our changing global landscape. Okay, let's jump right into this mystery with a question that baffled absolutely everyone when it first hit the headlines. Why on earth did the United States try to buy Greenland from Denmark? It honestly sounded like a late-night talk show punchline, right? But it was a very real, very serious foreign policy maneuver.
A changing world order, the end of an era.
To solve this puzzle, we've got to establish what is actually happening to our global landscape. Think back to some of these seemingly bizarre foreign policy actions from the Trump administration. The U.S. attempting to buy territory from Denmark, aggressive moves to capture Venezuelan oil, massive, unexpected tariffs slapped right onto India. Now, to the untrained eye, this just looks like complete chaos. But it's actually a symptom of a much larger systemic collapse. These events perfectly illustrate a brand new consensus among experts. The old system, free trade, international law, respected borders, it's effectively over. For decades, institutions like the UN and the World Trade Organization basically guaranteed a predictable world. But with great powers now routinely bypassing those institutions and essentially redrawing maps, political scientists universally agree that the post-WW2 order is completely dead. Great power competition. Theory 1. The decoy. So what replaces that old order? Well, the most common explanation given by strategists, and probably what you hear most on cable news, is a return to great power competition. Under this Westphalian framework, nations act logically, purely to protect their own borders and consolidate power. It assumes the world is just inherently dangerous, and powers like the US, China, and Russia just have to do everything possible to survive and secure their national interests above everything else. Under this specific theory, aggressive moves, like invoking the Monroe Doctrine, are framed as flexible realism. Basically, it's viewed as a necessary grand strategy to fend off rivals. It's cold, it's calculated, but it's highly logical. You consolidate power close to home, you grab the vital resources you need, and you make sure your enemies can't get to them first. Makes sense, right? Where the theory fails, poking holes in the narrative. But here is where our detective work really begins, because when you look closer, this academic theory completely falls apart. We have to stop and ask ourselves, if the ultimate goal is purely national defense against rivals, why alienate your most loyal partners like Canada and Denmark? Why pick fights with nations that pose absolutely zero threat to your survival? When you test these events against the Great Power Framework, the math simply does not add up. None of these actions actually improved national security. Take Venezuelan oil. It's incredibly expensive to extract, so it offers very little economic benefit to the U.S. Russia and China, they barely even have a footprint in Greenland. Plus, the U.S. military already had unlimited access there anyway. And slapping tariffs on India? India is China's natural rival. If you're trying to balance against China, you absolutely want India on your side, not alienated. The neo-royalist lens. Theory 2. The twist. To actually make sense of these pieces, we need to introduce a totally different framework, the neo-royalist theory. I absolutely love this analogy from researchers Stacy Goddard and Abraham Newman. They essentially compare our modern international order to Game of Thrones. Think about historical dynasties for a second. The ruling elite didn't make decisions based on what was best for the everyday peasant. They just cared about redistributing resources amongst their specific noble houses.
So instead of nations fighting for survival, neo-royalism argues it's about personalized sovereigns and their courts using state power to enrich themselves, much like the world before 1648. Under this lens, a country's foreign policy is hijacked by a small ruling clique. The geopolitical game isn't state versus state anymore. It's billionaire donor versus billionaire donor, and they're using the military and economic weight of entire countries as their personal chess pieces.
Putting these two theories side by side, the contrast is super stark. It is literally the difference between a country acting to protect its citizens versus a leader acting to elevate their billionaire backers. On one hand, you have a calculated game of chess for national survival. On the other, a system driven entirely by personal wealth, individual status, and ego. Kings, courts, and billionaires. Solving the mystery. Now, armed with this neo-royalist lens, let's look back at those initial 3 mysteries under the Trump administration. National interest totally fails to explain these events, but personal financial interests and bruised egos explain them flawlessly. Going after Venezuela's oil didn't help the US, but it directly benefited specific refineries owned by mega donors, like John Edison. Trying to buy Greenland? That wasn't about blocking China. It was reportedly pushed by billionaires like Ronald Lauder, who had vast mineral interests and direct access to the administration. And those India tariffs? The neo-royalist theory argues they were a direct retaliation after Prime Minister Modi publicly bruised Donald Trump's ego. When you look at it this way, it all suddenly makes terrifying sense. What it means for you, the real-world impact.
Now, you might be wondering, why does it actually matter to you if we live in a world of great powers versus neo-royalists? Well, simply put, a system based on the personal whims and wealth of a few elites is incredibly unstable. A nation-state acting logically to defend itself, that's predictable. But a personalized sovereign acting on impulse or the financial demands of their donors, that is wildly unpredictable.
When state power is used like a medieval fiefdom, everyday citizens become poorer and way less secure. We're talking about sudden trade wars that hike up the cost of your groceries overnight. We're talking about military force deployed not to keep you safe, but to boost a leader's status on the world stage. This kind of volatility stifles economic growth, making the average person significantly poorer, all while these modern kings control weapons that could end civilization at the click of a button. So, I'm going to leave you with this final thought. As the old rules fade away, we have to recognize the game that is actually being played. Are you prepared for a future driven by royalist whims instead of national security? Because understanding whether your leaders are playing great power chess or a neo-royalist Game of Thrones is truly the only way to predict what comes next. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and stay curious.